Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here today. I'm Stephen Fagan, the curator of the museum. And this living history conversation is an extension of our museum's ongoing oral history project, which has captured about 2,500 recollections from people around the world, their memories of President Kennedy, the assassination, and the 1960s. And today, I am joined by a longtime friend of the museum, someone I've known almost 20 years now, who was here 60 years ago on November 22nd, 1963, right across the street when she was an ear witness to the assassination and heard shots fired at the presidential motorcade. Please join me in welcoming Gretchen Coben to share her story today. Gretchen, thanks so much for being here. Even though we've known each other a long time, this is your very first museum public program.
It is.
We're thrilled to have you, and we're going to start by embarrassing you just a little bit by showing a picture of you from 1963. There you are up on screen. You're looking lovely with your hair. It's just a great, great photo. And the building we're looking at is the Old Red Courthouse in Dealey Plaza. And Gretchen, that is where you worked from about 1962 to 1965. Right?
Correct.
You were a social worker. Tell us a little bit about your work in the Old Red Courthouse.
I worked on the second floor of the Old Red Courthouse, and I worked for the state of Texas Department of Public Welfare. And I was a caseworker in the children's division. And I had an office on the ledge, close to the ledge of the second floor, facing Main Street, with a large window that was behind my desk. And I worked there. I had graduated from SMU, and I'm a native Dallasite. And so coming downtown to Dallas was just very normal for me, and working for the state felt very comfortable.
And the Old Red Courthouse was not exactly modernized at that time. Tell us a little bit about the conditions you worked in.
Well, the conditions that the courthouse was in those years was probably about like it was in 1900, 1920. There was no air conditioning. There were open windows. Pigeons flew in and out on a pretty regular basis. And in the wintertime, there was steam heat from the old looped steam heaters. Some of you that are older remember, grandparents, you remember when we had those. It was very, very primitive. It was very dirty. It was, the floor was black and white tile. It was just not a very clean place. And some of us would take a weekend off and come down and try to clean our offices. It was just kind of primitive, let's say.
You mentioned the pigeons. There's a little more to that story.
Yes, that's right. There were pigeons that flew in and out of the windows. And some of the maintenance men at the end of the floor would go to the nests of the pigeons, get their eggs, and in the men's restroom, they would fry pigeon eggs. And we could smell the eggs all the way into our office if you went out into the hallway. So it was a very colorful place to work as a young person just out of college.
Did you ever taste the pigeon eggs?
No, never did. Smell them.
So just to orient folks a little bit, to show you where the Old Red Courthouse is in relation to the assassination site, you can see it there on the right, the castle structure, and you can see the building we're in today with the Hertz Rent-A-Car sign on top on the left-hand side. So pretty close to Elm Street and the site of the assassination. And Gretchen, in those days, you parked your car. We can't quite see it in this photograph, but where those cars are at the bottom, to the left of those vehicles.
Yes.
Sort of directly behind this building.
Right. There were just open space and gravel parking lots behind the Hertz sign building there. And we would park there free and then walk as far as we needed to get to the Old Red Courthouse.
And so you would have a view of this building, pretty much like this one, from around the place you would park. Now, you knew the name because it's written there on the side of the building, but did you know anything about this warehouse?
Completely ignored it. It was just a big building that we walked past going to work. Nothing more.
A nondescript warehouse?
Nondescript. School book depository, though, for years.
Yeah.
So that was always there.
But it would suddenly take on some global significance.
That's right.
During the time you worked at
That's
Old
right.
Red. Let's talk about President Kennedy for a minute. You were a fan of his, right?
Yes, I was. If you were young then, the world was so very different. I'm 83, so you can put this in perspective. But there was a sense about President Kennedy that I would say there was hope. When he was president, he was so inspiring. And occasionally on my field days, I would take my lunch break in my apartment so that I could see his newscast, because that was so unusual then for a president to appear before reporters. And of course, the TVs then were all black and white. But he was just so smart, so witty, just a real inspirational a leader. And he really made you feel that you could make the world a better place. Great time to be young.
And how did you feel when you found out that your president was going to be driving right by the building where you worked?
Well, I knew exactly where he was going to be coming because, like I described, this office of mine had this large window, and there's a ledge that you can see that's, much wider than this stage. So the day before, maybe 2 days before, I was told by my supervisor that I can't remember now, either the FBI or the Secret Service was going to come by and go through my office because they wanted to go out on the ledge. They wanted to check the ledge. And so he appeared, coat and tie, very polite, went out on the ledge to check. And I really didn't think too much more about it. Of course, he had a perfect view, of everything downtown. And we knew he would be coming right under our office there. And that's why we were all out on the ledge waiting for him right there, because we knew what was going to happen. But I didn't really think too much about it.
So this man that we presume is a Secret Service agent, he didn't ask any questions or to check the credentials of anybody in the building or anything
Not
like
at all.
that?
Nothing.
Right.
Just wanted to come through because that was a good window.
Right. There's a picture up on the screen here that's actually never been shown before.
Oh,
You guys are really the first ones to see it. The original picture is so dark, it's practically black, but our marketing manager, Emily, was able to brighten this image, so we're finally able to pull some detail out of it. It's pretty grainy. It looks like it was taken in the 1890s, which is appropriate considering it's the Old Red Courthouse. But Gretchen, we can see a few people in light-colored clothing there up on the second floor, and you are among them because this is maybe about half an hour or so before the parade went by. You've got a great vantage point there, and you can see just a few people there on the street. It's going to get more crowded as it gets closer and closer to the time the president's going to be passing by. And then here we have the crowds as the motorcade is coming by. Estimated that about 200,000 people turned out to greet the parade that day. Gretchen, from where you were right there at the corner of Main and Houston, were you able to kind of crane your neck and look down and see some of those crowds?
Oh, sure. Yeah, because we could lean forward and see the cars coming down Main. Of course, they were unbelievably, they were all open cars then. Something, we would never think of now. But it was very exciting. All along, you could see people shouting and happy and real excited that the president was there.
There had been some concern about Kennedy's safety. He wasn't particularly popular in Dallas. We'll talk in a little bit about some of the comments your coworkers made after the assassination. But do you remember having any apprehension that day that there may be some demonstration or anything happen? No?
No.
Okay, just excitement.
That's right.
Okay, all right. So here we have a great series of pictures taken by a bystander named Phil Willis. And here we see the motorcycles leading the parade. And if you look up in the right-hand corner, there is that balcony at the Old Red Courthouse where Gretchen is standing. Do you remember what side of the balcony you were on?
I was closer to this end.
Closer to Houston Street.
Right.
Okay. All right. So you're up there somewhere in that slightly blurry picture. So you see the motorcycles, and suddenly here comes President Kennedy. Great, great photograph. You can see President Kennedy's head is in the process of turning towards the courthouse. Gretchen, take us through this moment and tell us what you remember seeing.
Well, I remember just, it was a day very much like today. It was overcast, but right before they came down Main Street, the sun came out. And so as they passed under us, and you can imagine an open car with the president just right below you. You got a sense and a view of him that nobody on the street could, but he was right there. But I was so taken because his hair was slightly red, and I'd only seen black and white television. I had no idea that he had that red color to his hair. And Mrs. Kennedy was sitting there, and when she saw us on this old building, she nudged him to look up, and he looked up and waved and smiled, a big, big smile.
Did President Kennedy look the same to you as he appeared on television or in Life magazine?
Well, except the red hair.
Except for that red hair.
Well, I think probably they colored it in some of the magazines, but in person it was surprising.
So the motorcade makes that turn from Maine onto Houston, and it disappears from your sight. You can't really see it as it's coming up Houston towards this building.
That's
approaching that turn onto Elm.
Yes, turning onto Elm.
Do people on the balcony, once he passes by, do some of them start going inside?
Yes, some did.
Okay, but you did not.
No, I was with a woman that was my supervisor, and we were down at the end.
And tell us what happens next.
Well, we heard this very loud boom. And at first, we didn't know what, we thought maybe it was a car backfiring. And so people were sort of startled because it was so loud. And then another boom, boom, close together. And by then, we knew, because they had turned, that something had happened, because you could see the crowd. You could see the people excited, and something terrible had happened. And then Lou, my supervisor, and I could see the pink outfit that Mrs. Kennedy had on that day. By that time, everybody all around was screaming or running. They were so confused because nobody knew where the sound was coming from. Nobody knew that there was a gunshot. So, in those days, women didn't wear pants. We had to wear a skirt all the time. And so I can remember grabbing this full skirt so I could run faster. And my supervisor and I ran down the stairs, ran across the street, and there was just utter chaos. People were wandering. They didn't know what happened. Someone said that a policeman, in those days, the police had those motorcycles that had the container or seat on the back. Somebody said that a young boy was over and arrested, so that we kind of thought, well, maybe he was the shooter, or he had tried to shoot, or we didn't know what was happening. We really did not know the extent of what had happened until later.
So the young boy that you've mentioned was actually an eyewitness, a high school student named Amos Ewens, but he was put in a police car, or police did question him. So it did appear to some as if he might have been detained for some involvement in the assassination. Going back to a moment to your eyewitness or ear witness account, as you're hearing those shots fired, you mentioned you heard a boom, and then there was a pause.
The slight pause, and then there were two more booms. But it was, now there's been a lot of question I can only talk about what I heard, about what actually happened. But it was so obvious that the shots were coming from Houston and Elm. It was here, it was just the sound was coming from this area. And so you don't ever forget that.
So it really did sound like this direction towards the school book depository, as opposed to the other area that is
It's not there.
so famous, the grassy
That's
knoll
right.
area. Okay.
That's right.
All three shots that you heard sounded consistent, like they came from the same direction.
That's right.
Okay. These are all important questions that researchers are still very curious about. And Gretchen, you were not interviewed at the time by local law enforcement, never interviewed by the FBI, certainly not testified before the Warren Commission, even though you heard the shots fired that day. So your account is very significant. And I can tell you, in the 20 years I've known Gretchen, you've told that exact same story about
You
hearing
don't
those
forget
three
it.
shots. So you and your supervisor and your heavy skirts, you go running. You see people. I think you've told me in the past you heard screaming in the plaza.
Some screaming because I think maybe those that were closer, right next to the car, probably saw, this trauma that was occurring in the car. And they were so much closer to Mrs. Kennedy and and then they saw the Secret Service trying to get up on the car and then take off for the hospital. So they were hysterical. Some were just screaming and crying, but then nobody knew what to do.
So seeing that something had happened, that streak of pink going by Mrs. Kennedy on the back of the car, and hearing the screaming, you choose to run towards it?
No, we didn't. Well, no, that was, yes, we did. We did. But after we got down there, we knew that there was nothing that we could do because the cars had already gone and the police were trying to escort, all the cars that were with him to get up onto Stemmons, to get over to the hospital.
No real sense of danger. You were more curious than anything?
Yeah, because in those years, you really couldn't imagine something like this. You couldn't imagine something like this happening.
Yeah. Now, besides hearing about the young boy that had been taken into custody, did you get a sense from the crowd or the police officers that were around the entrance to this building what exactly took place? You really didn't know about the shooting itself until you got back to your office, right?
Right,
Okay.
right. People were wandering around this building out here. They were on the grass. They were on the sidewalk. We were just, it was so shocking and so traumatic that people didn't know what to think. So they were looking for information, looking for something that they could help them understand what had happened.
No television back at Old Red, but you had a radio. So tell us a little bit about hearing the news.
Well, we heard the news. I guess it was, I don't know how long it was on that the president had been shot. And then we stayed all gathered around this radio. There were probably maybe 8 or 10 caseworkers. And then after a while, the announcement was on the radio that President Kennedy was dead. And so you want me to talk about what was said? Or?
Well, first tell us how you felt. You had just seen this man, you had waved to him. How did you feel when his death was announced?
Well, you kind of are traumatized. You're in shock. You just can't believe this is happening in America. You can't believe it's in Dallas. But then you just felt this overwhelming sense of sadness and grief, because especially if you're a young and a Kennedy kid, so to speak, you're going to change the world, make the world a better place. It's crushing. It's just crushing. So that's how I felt.
Not everybody at Old Red was a Kennedy kid. Tell us a little bit about some of the reactions that you recall from your coworkers.
Well, there were some of the coworkers that felt like I did, but there were other coworkers that there was a coworker, the supervisor, made some terrible remarks about if his brother comes to town, I hope they do the same thing to him. And there was another person that made a remark that, well, the worst thing about this is Johnson's going to be president. So I was thinking about this earlier before I came down to today to the museum, and I think about the world we live in now that's so filled with hate and just terrible, terrible things that are happening all the time. And there was some of that then too. So I think maybe lots of times in our history, we have ill feelings toward our fellow man, and it was not a good experience then for me.
I'm sure. So they dismissed you from work pretty quickly.
Early. Mm-hmm.
We have a picture here that rarely gets seen of cars leaving that back parking lot over here. Now, I've asked you about this before. You weren't questioned. No one asked you if you had seen or heard anything that day as you're walking back or leaving the parking lot. No one paid any attention, right?
That's right. Even though some of us, that saw it, but I think they were so focused on finding out who it was and capturing him, and that's where the focus was, not about what happened even later. And then the focus, I think, became the hospital and what the doctors found in terms of his injuries. And then, of course, Jack Ruby and all the other things that happened after that. The focus was never on maybe taking some historical facts from people that were down here and saw it.
Of course, after the funeral, you had to go back to work, but everything had changed. This was now the site of the Kennedy assassination. How did that change how you felt when you would park your car by the Texas School Book Depository and walk over to Old Red?
Well, you never forgot it. And like I said, I'm 83 and I never come downtown that I don't pass this area and think about it and remember. So
it's so interesting to me that nobody ever went over to Old Red, FBI, Dallas police. No one ever went to Old Red to just question staff there if they had seen or heard anything that day.
Right.
But you don't remember anything like that at all.
Nothing.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah.
And yet Old Red was the site of a great deal of media significance because early the next year, Jack Ruby goes on trial at the Criminal Courts building. We can see
there, right.
We can see Old Red. We can see that balcony and your office window over there, and all those people gather on the street with their eyes towards the county criminal courthouse building. What was that like as the so-called trial of the century takes place right across from you?
Well, I think by that time we were just so inundated with all this information. We knew what had happened. And I think there's big courtrooms in Old Red where some of the trials took place, parts of the trial took place there. And so I don't know whether it was witnesses, but by that time, everybody was used to it and we were going about the business of taking care of children.
Did you feel any sense of guilt or shame? Dallas came under a great deal of criticism after the assassination. Did you ever have anyone confront you because you were from Dallas?
Not really. Not really.
Okay.
No, because I always tried to stay close with people, that felt the same as I did about Kennedy.
I see. So, last picture we're going to look at today is a few years later, 1970, after the John F. Kennedy Memorial, which is still there. You can go see it today if you'd like, is now there behind the Old Red Courthouse. Gretchen, you were gone by 65, so you weren't there for the memorial in 70. But I'm interested in sort of the legacy of the assassination as far as the impact it's had on your life. This has not been something you have really enjoyed talking about much over the years. You haven't told very many people about your eyewitness account.
I didn't talk about it. I was sitting next to a woman that was really one of the founders of the museum one day at a luncheon. Linda Lynn Adams. And we were talking about Dallas, and in the course of the conversation, I mentioned to her that I had been down here. Well, she jumped right on it and sent me over to talk about it. And gosh, that's, I don't know, maybe that's 15 years ago or something like that.
20.
I didn't talk about it for a long time, frankly, because sometimes if I talked about it, I'd start crying. And I think it was very traumatic for me as a young person feeling like I did. So, but I hope we've all learned a lesson about it. I hope we've all learned about hatred and respect for other people, all politicians, really. So,
your association with Old Red didn't quite end in 1965, though, because you were featured there for about 15 years or so. There was a museum in that building, the Old Red Museum of Dallas County History and Culture, and you were the featured storyteller in their Kennedy assassination section. How did that happen?
Well, that was after Linda Lynn found out that I should be telling the story, I guess. So
you went back out on that balcony and did a little interview for a film that was shown over there.
Yes, that was with Darwin Payne, a longtime broadcaster here in Dallas, and we went out on the balcony and talked a little bit about it, and about 15 or 20 minutes. I think it's because I was only 22 at the time, and I was going to be 23 that December, but I couldn't vote for him then, and I was so young, and the times were very different, so just didn't talk a lot about it. So,
one final story to kind of end this on a poignant note. You told me about when you got to go to Arlington National Cemetery and see President Kennedy's gravesite for the first time. Can you share that?
I forgot I told you that.
I forget nothing.
When I turned 50, a good friend of mine and my childhood friend, we grew up here in Dallas together. Her husband gave us some miles on American Airlines, and he said, "You girls can go anywhere you want to go." So we said, "We want to go to Washington, D.C." So we went to D.C., got there late. We had gone earlier, and we were big flea market shoppers then, and we had all of our gear, went into this fancy hotel across the street from the White House with bird cages and everything else, and they bumped us up to this really nice floor. They were being so nice to us. But anyway, it was almost dark, and I said, "Ann, I want to go over to see the Kennedy Memorial." And we went over, and the guard was there, and it was dusk, and the cemetery had closed. And so we pulled up, and I said, "Oh, if we could just see his gravesite." And he opened this gate and let us go in. And we were the only people to be able to visit his grave at that time of night. It was a beautiful experience. The flame was there. All of his great speeches were, embellished on the rocks around his gravesite. And that was a gift, a real gift.
Well, you are a gift to this museum,
Well,
and we are
thank
so
you,
honored
Stephen.
to have you here.
Thank you, Stephen.
Please join me in thanking Gretchen Coben.
Oh, thank you.